webinar today. We're really pleased that you've been able to join us to meet Catherine and to hear her presentation. Before we jump on and introduce Catherine, I just wanted to double check that everybody can hear. So if for any reason you cannot, if you can send through a question saying, I cannot hear, please speak louder, or please unmute yourself, that would be great. Great. We've got one saying good volume, so we'll kick off. We're very, very pleased today to have Catherine Cahill join us from Worksense Solutions. Catherine is a principal consultant at Worksense, where she works very closely with companies and individuals to find and create solutions that help people work more effectively with each other and also with the workplace, so that workplaces can find and retain really great people. She's had over 20 years experience working with HR in fairly diverse workplaces, ranging from top ASX listed companies through to SMEs and high-growth organizations. Catherine's experience is through workplace behavior, employment law, recruiting and building strong teams, people management, managing and preventing bullying, harassment, discrimination, performance management, and change management. So she likes to work with organizations to get to the source of what individual and workplace problems are and find effective solutions to come and bypass them. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who can start the presentation. And welcome to Risq Group, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you for everyone who's joining with us today. Jo and I were just chatting before the presentation, and I mentioned that my focus on this webinar is really from the point of view of working with many clients to resolve workplace issues. So the bulk of my work is going into organisations once there's a serious problem. And then inevitably, once we've resolved the problem, the owner of the organisation or the senior executive will say to me, now what do we do so that this doesn't happen again? And that's really where I come from when I look at these situations. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to assume that people know everything about recruitment, and I'm not going to assume that people know nothing about recruitment. I've looked at the guest list, and you all come from quite a broad background, different levels of experience. I'm going to talk to you about my personal experience and what I've learned in helping organisations fix problems. And obviously, if you can stop the problems from occurring in the first place, you're going to have a much better workplace. So that's where I'm coming from. So basically, I'll be talking to you. The first point is to actually challenge what your managers are telling you about what they want in a role. That's the first thing. Setting and communicating a realistic time frame so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're being expected to do something in a time frame that's unrealistic. We're going to, of course, touch on best practice background checks and talk about avoiding some of the costly mistakes that I've seen in organisations, and the real importance of an onboarding experience that works for everybody. So there was an article in the New York Times with Laszlo Bock, who's the head of people at Google. And Google are really good with crunching numbers, looking at data. And so he went through the process of trying to look at the prediction of a person's performance based on their interview and their actual performance at work. And this study involved tens and thousands of interviews that they had done. And what they found was that there was absolutely zero relationship between what the people at the recruitment end of the process said the person would be and how they actually performed. And he actually said it was a complete random mess. And I think, I'm not saying to you that that's possibly what's going on in your organisation, but what I would say is most organisations don't go to the trouble of checking whether their assessment of a person at the beginning of the work relationship matches to their performance on the job. And if we start from the perspective of looking at how we do the recruitment and then follow that through the workplace relationship with that person, we're going to get much better results. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of trouble with the slides. So the first thing that I see in organisations, and what I've experienced when I've been working in-house, someone resigns, their manager gets on the phone to HR or recruitment and says, want you to replace this person. They've given me 4 weeks notice, so what I'd like is a 2-week handover, so I need you to get me, the best person in the country within 2 weeks. And that's the point where you need to challenge people about that time frame. You also need to really challenge them when they say, oh, you've got the job description, just use the same one as we used last time. If a job description is more than 12 months old, you need to review it. I sit down with the manager in this situation and have a conversation with them about how the incumbent in the role worked. And I ask them what was great about them, what was not so great. If you could create the perfect employee, what would that person look like? And you will find that there'll be changes to the job description that comes out of that particular discussion. I also think it's really important to look at the group as a whole. And what happens in some teams, let's say if you've got a communications team, you'll have a whole lot of people who are great at talking, maybe not so many people who are good at detail. And so what you may need in that team is the person who's going to look at the detail for them. Also, if you look at an accounts team or an IT team, and I realise I'm generalising, you may find you've got a lot of people who are very detail-oriented but not very good at communication. And so looking at who you've got in the team and how you can bring other skills to round out the team at that stage of working out the job description can also help on the job. Obviously, you know that you need to find out the technical skills that are required, but we also need to really challenge the interpersonal skills that we're being asked to get. I've yet to see a job description that doesn't say excellent interpersonal skills, top class written and verbal skills. If I'm recruiting someone into a technical role who has nothing to do with external clients, do they really have to have excellent interpersonal skills? And are we going to recruit on that basis rather than on the basis of the technical skills? So just challenging those words that we use routinely. Have a look at the ads you've written. Most of the time we use these very high level, must be the bestest and the greatest at everything, and that's actually not a true reflection of the role. And the other piece that I see when I come into organisations and there's problems in a work team is sometimes we put someone in a role where they're required to complete work on their own and they're a very gregarious, sociable person and they find that really difficult. Or you put someone in a role where they have to work in a team and they actually don't like working in teams, they need to work alone. So that one question can also help prevent problems once you get the person in the team. Recruiting for values is something that it's becoming a bit of a hot topic. I recently went to a seminar where the general manager of IKEA in Australia spoke, and they spoke about this radical system they had introduced for recruitment where they actually ask people questions around their values before they ask for CVs. So they screen people out on the basis of their values before they even look at a CV. I understand in most organisations that's going to be a step too far, but they're actually starting to track really good results from that. And the reason why values are important is when you think about the difficulties that you have with employees at work, sometimes it's their technical ability. More often than not, though, it's their behaviours, and it's the behaviours that are going to make a difference about whether or not they fit in the team. We all have different values and different behaviours, and when I am coaching people on finding their own perfect role, I'm actually coaching people to ask values questions as well, so that it's a bit like dating. You need to know you're going to be in a relationship with someone that you actually want to be with. So values questions help you to clarify how a person works, how they approach their work. You'll see on this slide there's a lot of questions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll pick a couple of them just to illustrate my point. If you're trying to understand how someone approaches a problem and you say, tell me how you resolve something difficult, they will go through the process of telling you the technical side of it, the operational side of it. But in a values question, you're trying to understand how they felt about it and how they addressed it. So the two questions that I'd ask at the very least is, who was your best manager and why, and who was your worst manager and why. And when you're talking about the who was your worst manager and why, the other important question is, and what did you do about it? It's a much better question than the usual one we have a tendency to ask, which is, tell me about your weaknesses. Because everybody is so used to this question now, they come up with a weakness that's not really a weakness. So they'll tell you their weakness is that, oh, they just work too hard, or perhaps, you know, they put in too many hours, or they're such a perfectionist they can never let anything go without making sure it's perfect. So it doesn't really give you a good answer, whereas asking these really open questions about how someone related to another person in the organisation allows you to see, is this a person that's going to fit in with the values of our organisation and the way we work or not? Because you'd really rather know that up front than once they're in the job. Time frame. This is the biggie, and I'm sure most of you have experienced this, that I spoke about originally, is someone's leaving, they're leaving in 4 weeks, I want you to find me the greatest person on the planet and I want you to do it in 2 weeks so that we've got a 2-week handover. I've gone through this timeline with so many different clients at different times because people just don't think it through. If you are going to advertise the job for 1 week or 2 weeks, which most people think is, you know, probably the shortest time frame, there's your 2 weeks gone already. So you've got to wait 2 weeks before you start the interview process or before you've finished the screening process at the very least. Then you've got to shortlist and schedule interviews. You've got to make sure that the people you want to see are available when you need to see them, and the managers who are interviewing them are available when you want to see them. So I think you're probably looking at a minimum of a week there. Then you're doing the interviews. Let's say 2 weeks, if you're doing first interviews and second interviews, 2 weeks is a very, very ambitious time frame. And of course you've got to do your background checks. How many of us have experienced phoning the referees, waiting, they phone us, they miss us, we have this, you know, email and phone ping pong going on. So that really expands the time. Obviously, if you use an external provider like Risq for your reference checks, that can speed up that process for you. But they're going to do a very thorough job, and that's not going to happen overnight either. And then the person you decide to, who you offer the job to, probably has a period. So that's another 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So just looking at that basic level, it's 8 to 12 weeks. Now, I know that if you're recruiting people, for example, who are students or relatively low level, skill level, you can do this process pretty quickly. You can put an ad in so you can get, you know, a lot of applications in the space of a week. So obviously I'm talking about the higher level jobs or the more complex jobs, but that's my strongest piece of advice to anyone in recruitment, is to be realistic about the time frame, because if someone's putting pressure on you to deliver in a time frame that's impossible, you will always feel like you're letting them down. They will always feel like you're not doing your job properly. And this is something you continuously need to communicate. Don't think you only say it once. Believe me, you'll be saying it many times. Best practice background checks. I have to say, in my experience, when I've gone into organisations, because there has been a really awful problem, and I'm thinking particularly in regard to bullying, what we find is that there has not been good background checks. There has not been a real attempt to find out how this person behaved and how this person works. And so it's one of those things that, going back to Google's quote that he found no correlation between the interview and the performance, this is the piece that's really going to help you flesh out whether what you see in the interview plays out in the workplace. And this is when I get to one of my, probably my favourite topics at the moment, is the corporate psychopath. This might be a new term to you, or you might be familiar with it. If you Google it after this session, you will find a lot of papers and a lot of resources on this. It's the people who behave this way can cause more damage to your organisation than any other people. They're the people that come in, they're super charming. You cannot believe they've walked through your door because they tick every single box. They do everything you want them to do. Doesn't matter what question you come up with, they've got the perfect answer. There is nothing they cannot do. And chances are they're quite good looking as well, and charming, or at the very least they're charming and well dressed. What I find is even the most cautious recruiters, when confronted with this type of person, can find themselves not doing what they normally do. I did a case very recently where the manager said to me, it's the only time I've not done a reference check on someone because this person was so perfect, I literally didn't want them to walk out the door without giving them the job. So if you ever feel about someone, that's an alarm bell. You really need to do your background checks, and you need to make sure that you really are talking to the right people and they're genuine reference checks, and that's where an external provider can help you. So, and the reason why these people are so destructive in your organisation is because they're very good at managing upwards and they're terrible in the way they treat everybody else in the team, and they can cause so much pain to your organisation. It can take you an awful lot longer than they were in the business to recover from the damage that they did. The other person that I'd like to suggest that you need to look more closely at is the one who doesn't appear to be doing very well in the interview. Sometimes a person will come for an interview who's clearly extremely nervous, and I would suggest to you that if the manager is saying, oh no, clearly they don't know how to deal with people, they're going to be hopeless, you might want to do a reference check just to find out how they work on the job. In my experience, some people who appear really nervous and do very poorly in interviews, if you check them out thoroughly and then bring them into your business, they make your best employees because they're so easy to overlook. And they've probably had so many bad interview experiences because the first interview they didn't work and the second one didn't work, and so by the time they get to you, they're actually really anxious. And I set myself a little challenge when I've got people like that in front of me to do everything I can to try and make them comfortable. And even though I think I'm pretty good at that, I've had people that are still sitting there sweating bucket loads and shaking hands and hardly able to speak because they're so nervous. It may be that that's the way they perform on the job and that would be an issue. All I'm suggesting is rather than assuming that, do your background checks. You might find that this is one of your quiet achievers in your business who will never let you down. So that's my risk management aspect of recruitment. Don't be fooled by the super charming person, and don't overlook the person who appears to have virtually no charm. Unusual way of approaching interviews, but give it a go and see how it works for you. The other part of the recruitment puzzle that I see, and this is because I work with individual clients also, helping them to find their perfect job. The most common thing that I see with individuals and also internally with recruited people is they get to about the 6 to 12 week mark in the job and they have a bit of a crisis. And if you're lucky, they'll come and tell you about it. And they'll say something like, I think I've made a terrible mistake. This is the worst job I've ever had in my life. I don't think I should be here. And the reason they feel that way is because what they were told in the interview and what they actually heard, which isn't always the same thing, and what they're experiencing on the job doesn't match. So the best way that I've learned and the best advice I can give any client to avoid that 6 to 12 week crisis moment is to check in early and to check in often. So literally at the end of first week, week one, I'm sitting down with the person, or I'm suggesting the manager sits down with the person and says, how's everything going? Do you have everything you need? Is this job what you expected? Now, at the end of first week, you're likely to get all positive responses. At the end of week 4, this is when you've got the big opportunity for the person to say, well, actually, in the job interview, I thought I was going to mainly be spending my time in this particular aspect, and what I've found is I'm working over here. And anyone who's ever been in a recruitment position has seen this happen. And it may be that the job's been poorly explained. It may also be that the person you interviewed heard the bits they wanted to hear. They heard the bits they liked, and that's what they decided the job was going to be about, but the bits they liked might only be a small part of the job, and you need to know that earlier rather than later. Or it may be that they've just not been given the tools and the training they need to do the job properly. Other side of that is the manager sitting there thinking, wow, this person isn't who I thought they were, and it may be something that can be cleared up by having that early check-in. It takes time, and I know everyone's busy and it's really hard to schedule in these things, but if you just, before they start, put half an hour in your calendar for each of these check-ins, you will reap the rewards for it. And it's a much quicker process and a much more positive process than ending up with a terrible situation further down the track that's going to take a lot of time to resolve. And anyone who's been doing HR for any length of time probably already has a process of doing performance reviews in the probation period. But I think every one of us, no matter how experienced or inexperienced we are, have experienced the situation where a manager rings and says, Fred, over in accounts, when does his probation period finish? And you look it up and you say, oh, tomorrow. And they go, right, I don't want to keep him. Can you get rid of him? And that's the thing that we never want to happen. What we want is to be checking in through that 6-month probation period so there's no surprises. Because Fred might actually have been a good performer if he'd had the check-in at week 1, week 4 and week 12. You know, people don't know what they don't know. When I come in after something has gone horribly wrong and I speak to the person who's underperforming, very often what I find is that their manager isn't the person they thought they were, or the manager's not giving them the information they need, or the job's not what they thought it was. And the earlier you can sort that out and fix it, or work out that you've actually made the wrong decision, the better it is for everyone around. So if you check in early and check in often, that's actually going to give people a good onboarding experience. Orientation is important, formal training is important, but the face-to-face conversation, the really honest, tell me, is this job what you thought it was going to be, will give you more answers and better information than anything else. So the whole point of doing things like this is to reduce the randomness that our friend from Google talked about. If you're not already doing this, start doing it. Start looking at tracking when you put an ad in and how long it takes to get responses. If you work in an industry that's really, really popular, and I've worked in very popular industries, your problem is you get too many applications and you've got to work out a way to efficiently get to the people who really do know what they're doing and you really want new business. Other businesses, and I've worked in those as well, struggle to get people to answer their ads and be interested in their business. So when you're doing your recruitment ads and your website for your staff and for your company's brand, you need to make sure that you're pitching it at the right level to get the people that you need in your business. No point in getting thousands of applications if they're not people that you need for the job. They're not going to work well with you. So track your ad success and you keep tweaking it. Track how long it takes you to recruit. You might find in your business that you can do it in 4 to 6 weeks, or you might find that it's longer than the 12 weeks that I've suggested. But if you have that data and you're tracking that data, that gives you an opportunity to demonstrate that to your managers and to your executives. Also, and this is something I've not seen too many organisations do what Google does. At the end of the recruitment process, ask the people involved for their prediction on how successful the new recruit will be, and then check in at 6 months, check in at 12 months, check in at 2 years. Were you right? How good was your prediction? analyse your turnover stats. Most HR people do this if they can get access to the data. And of course, we all hear the saying, people leave managers, not jobs. You need to know whether that's true for your business and for your managers. And exit interviews and surveys can give you very good information. What increases the likelihood of people being honest with you is making sure that they feel safe to give you the information. So I've had people not want to give me information in an exit interview because they're frightened their boss will get the information and then they won't get a good reference. So you do have to think about it from the point of view of how do I get good quality information to feed back to my managers and my executive without putting at risk getting quality and honest information from the people who are leaving. The second part of this, and this is something that most organisations that I've worked with don't do, is they don't actually have conversations with good employees and strong employees about why they stay. And that can give you as much information as why people leave. In fact, it's probably better. So even if you do nothing else, if you drew up a list of maybe your top 10 or 20 people in the organisation as far as how well they fit in your organisation and how well they do in their work, and just have a chat with them. Just say, love your work, tell me what makes you stay, why do you like working with us, what is it about this organisation that makes you so happy and so motivated to perform. And if the information you get out of those conversations doesn't match your stated values, I'd suggest you need to look at your values. And if you don't have a list of values, or you have a list of values that are on your website that nobody refers to, then you're really not a values-based organisation. Because your values, as I said, need to be integrated into every part of this process. So if you're collecting this data, you need to be analysing it all the time to see whether you can make things work better, to make the whole process less random. And don't be afraid to speak about it with your organisation. If you're not telling them what you're doing and what you're finding, then you can't assume that they understand how you're managing this process. The more information you give them, the more data that you give them, the easier it will be for you to have these really honest conversations with them about who's going to work well in the organisation and who isn't. You'll be doing a much better job helping the people at the top of the organisation see what you do and how it directly impacts on the profitability and the success of your organisation. So in HR, we often say it's much harder for us to measure the success of what we're doing and the impact on the bottom line, but I would suggest we can all pretty well put a dollar figure on what turnover costs us. So if you're reporting on what you're doing to reduce turnover and increase the effectiveness of new recruitment, you will be demonstrating to the organisation that you're making a real impact on the bottom line, as well as, let's not forget, to the culture of the organisation.
So before we jump on to questions, Catherine, were there any other concluding thoughts that you wanted to share, or would you like to open up the floor? I can see that there's some questions come through already.
Oh, look, if we've got questions, I'd be happy to take questions from people.
Perfect. So we've got one that's come through about what questions would you ask somebody who was nervous during an interview to try and get to their real personality?
Okay. What I do with people when I can see that they're really nervous is I have a tendency to put people at ease by just being brutally honest with them. And that sounds really strange because you think, well, aren't we always brutally honest? But if you think about an interview situation, it's very artificial. You know, everyone's sitting there in their best clothes, all very formal and everything's set up. If you've got a really nervous person and you can see that they're nervous, try and let go of that formality. I'm a mum, so I must admit I kind of use the mum tag on them. And, you know, a young person sitting there sweating and I'll say, oh, I can see you're really nervous. Please don't be nervous. This is not an exam. This is not university. We just really want to get to know you. Glass of water there. Just take a breath, sit back, and try and relax. And it does actually work by calling out the fact that you can see that they're nervous. It doesn't make them more nervous. It helps them relax.
So there's another one that's come through about the time frames that you've sent on. Does our organisation like to have a handover period between the old employee and the new starter?
Yeah.
From the time frame that you specified, that doesn't look like it would necessarily always be possible. How valuable do you think that process is?
Okay, I actually question how important a handover is. I think it's really important that the person in the job is asked to document as much of the work that they're doing as they possibly can. So you have some sort of process written down. If a person has chosen to leave, and even if they've told you, oh, it's not you, it's me, love the place, just got offered a job that I couldn't resist, you still have to understand that there may be a level of unhappiness there that when they're working really closely with the new recruitee or the new recruited person, they may pass some of that off. And sometimes what we see is a bit of poisoning going on between the incumbent today and the new person. And that's actually not great. And I would suggest that that's a good reason not to do a handover. I'm not saying everybody's like that, but I don't get too hung up on handovers. If it can be done, that's great. But you really do need to sit down with your managers and realistically nut out that time frame. Because if you're just accepting the time frame they're giving you without thinking about the logistics of going through the process, you're setting yourself up to fail. And they start out by feeling that you're not doing your job. So that's why you have that conversation. And you're the best judge of how long it takes in your organisation. Maybe you really can recruit the perfect person with the perfect skills within 2 weeks. And if you can, then please contact me so that I can learn from you as well. I know in some roles that, you know, particularly if you're getting, if it's students, it's casual roles, that yes, the recruitment process probably can be done in a week or 2 weeks. And in that case, there's no handover anyway. So when we're talking about handover, we're probably talking about more complex, more professional jobs. I hope that answers your question.
There's another one about what kind of tests would you recommend to find out a person's value? Would you recommend psychometric testing?
Look, I have to say that if you did a Google search on values, you will get a lot of stuff thrown up. There's a particular instrument that I use, which is called Taylor's Core Values, that actually looks at the way people approach their work. And I use this not only with individuals to help them decide what type of work they want to do and help them work out the questions they're going to ask in an interview. I also use that with my clients so that they can do a core values assessment on the individuals in their team and see whether they've got the balance of skills that they need and the balance of values. And it's not that there's inherently good values and inherently bad values. It's making sure that the values the person has and the way they work actually fits with what you need in your organisation and in that team at that time. So there's no one particular tool I'd recommend. As I said, I've got my own that I use and I work really well with it, but there's a lot of different things on the market. When I was talking about IKEA testing for values before they did their recruitment, it wasn't a psychometric test. The slide with those questions, they literally sent questions to people like it was a bit of a school test. Please tell me, you know, who your favourite manager was and why. Or obviously, if you're recruiting school leavers, tell me about your favourite teacher. What they wanted to know was the attitude of the people who were applying for the jobs, and they wanted to know that these people were the sort of people that were going to go out of their way to help their customers and to resolve problems. And that's why they took that approach and got everyone to answer those questions. And it was only once they'd read those answers and thought, this is the person we want on our team, that they asked for their CVs. As I said, very radical. I appreciate that's not going to happen in a lot of organisations today. But it's working really well for them. And I was really excited when I heard about that because I think it's got a lot to show us, a different way of doing things.
So we've got another question, which is, what is the expected level of turnover in a call centre environment?
Now, call centres are notorious for having very high turnover. I worked in an organisation once where we had really high turnover in a particular sector of our business. What I did was I went onto the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and they have very good statistics broken down into different occupational groups. I don't know if they'll have call centres, but I think they might. The industry I was in was quite unusual, so there was no particular set of statistics for that industry, but we particularly recruited young people, so people generally between the age of 18 and 25, and mostly got them from a hospitality background. And what I discovered at that time, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, was that the average person under 25 was changing jobs every 2 years, and that the average turnover in hospitality was 30%. Our turnover was running at 28%. So I had a CEO saying, you know, this is outrageous, it should be 5%, that's what turnover is. The 5% turnover is in your banks and your insurance companies. So be very careful about judging your turnover on the basis of a completely different industry. Having said that, we did look very critically at our recruitment process and our onboarding process, and we reduced our turnover for that demographic from 30% down to 18%. So we beat the average in the other areas of work. So, but we were never going to get to 5%. That's the point of that story.
So what's the best practice on how and when we should follow up after interviews?
The best practice, as I said, is check in early, check in often. I would like to say that we should coach all our managers to have these conversations, and I think that's really important that they do. You're the best judge of how likely your managers are to do this. There's also a lot to be said for an independent person, so someone from the HR team, rather than the direct manager, sitting down with the person, looking them in the eye and so saying, hey, so tell me, is this job what you expected it to be? And actually having that conversation with the manager. You sit down with the manager and go, how's Fred working out? Is he the person you thought he was going to be? So often when I come into an organisation, because there are serious relationship breakdowns in that office, when I go back through what has happened, I realise that conversation very early in the process might have actually saved the relationship. But by the time I get in there, often it's a bit too late. And I do kind of I sometimes say to people, look, it's a bit like a marriage. The better you communicate, the better outcomes you're going to get. We can't assume that just because in the space of 2 90-minute interviews and some reference checks we decided this is the right person, that they're hearing what we really want them to hear, and they're actually understanding what we want them to do. Be very, very careful about what people pick up in interviews, because that happens a lot. Mm-hmm. There might be 10 things that you talk about in the interview. They hook into the 2 things they love. Mm-hmm. That's how they view your job. So you really do need to give them more information as time goes on, because you can't get it in there in the first interview and then expect that that's it.
Sure. So I'm interested in pre-employment health questionnaires, and what value do you put on these?
I'm a little bit cautious about a health questionnaire. I'm a big fan of functional assessments. I've got a strong health and safety background. I've worked with people who had been injured at work, and sometimes they were injured at work because they had a pre-existing condition that left them vulnerable. They should never have been put in that job. Putting someone in a job that they're physically not capable of doing is really an issue. I would recommend that to anyone who's employing people that do physical work, is to do a really tailored functional assessment. that's quite different to sending them to the local GP who's going to do blood pressure and heart monitoring and glucose level. I'm uncomfortable with that type of medical because I find it difficult to draw a line between the information you're getting from that medical and the person's capacity to do a job. You have to be careful, and it's covered by the Anti-Discrimination Act as well. If you are screening for anything, whether it's an intellectual psychometric test or it's a physical assessment, you do have to be able to say, I'm doing this because this person in this job needs to be able to do something that relates to that screening test that I'm doing. So, yeah, the blanket medicals I'm not a fan of, I have to say. I think they cause more problems than they resolve. You may end up finding information out about an employee that has nothing to do with their ability to do the job, and you may not offer them the job for other reasons, but you've actually opened up the door for them to say that you discriminated. That's a whole other topic.
Perfect. That's all the questions that we've got come through. In just the last couple of minutes, is there anything else that you'd like to say just to conclude the webinar?
I think because I work so much with people who are having great difficulties in the workplace relationships, my strong bias in my work is to say, work on the relationships. So from the moment you meet someone or from the moment someone applies for a job, you're starting to develop a relationship. And whatever you bring to that relationship will make a difference to how successful you are in getting the very best people for your organisation. And when I say the very best, that doesn't mean there's this small minority of people who are great and we're all fighting for them. Someone who's fabulous for my organisation may be completely wrong for your organisation, and that's why I've become very much focused on the values people bring to an organisation. If your organisation doesn't have clearly articulated values, or if you just have a list of words on your website called values but nobody lives by them, you need to go back to the drawing board on that. I truly believe that being true to your values and understanding your values in your organisation is going to make the biggest difference to how successful you are in recruiting the right people and having a really good relationship with them as long as they're with you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Catherine. I think that was incredibly interesting, and thank you very much for joining and sharing with us.
Thank you. And thank you for being there.
We will have a survey, a short survey. I think it's only 5 questions that will jump up at the very end of when you're logging out the webinar. If you could provide any feedback to us about future topics you'd like us to cover, or if there's any follow-up questions that you have for Catherine or for Risk Group, please pop them on here and we'll make sure that we follow up with you soon. Given the time of year, I'd just like to wish you all a Merry Christmas and thank you very much for joining us.
I'll be putting together a paper on what we've discussed, which will have more detail and also some nice links for you if you're interested in following up on particular issues like the values or the pre-employment questionnaires.
Perfect, and we'll make that available to everybody that's attended.
And have a really wonderful New Year, very successful New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you.